Welcome to the 11th episode of the Building Interactive Website series, where we'll go over how to dynamically access and modify HTML elements making use of JavaScript. So if content on our website cannot dynamically change, then we would call our website static, meaning everything stays the same the whole time that we're in the page. That's okay for simple websites like blog posts, but if we want a more interactive website, we need to make our web page dynamic by dynamically changing the elements on our page. So here, as you can see, I've already set up a couple of elements here that we're going to modify with JavaScript. So we can create our script tag to hold our JavaScript code. And the first way of selecting an element on the document is by its ID, like this paragraph with this test ID, for example. The way we do that is by making use of document and then a period, and the document has to be all lowercase, and then get element by ID, written in camel case like how I showcased in the last video, where the first word is lowercase and everything else after it is capitalized. And so then you put a pair of parentheses, and then in quotes you put the ID of the element that you want to get. For example, this test element here, this paragraph with ID of test, we can get it by making use of document.getElementById, and then inside quotes, inside parentheses, test. And in order to use it, we have to assign it to a variable. So we can call this variable test paragraph, for example. So we can use const, and we can use const here because this reference to this paragraph is never going to change. So we can say test paragraph and then equals. And now, as you can see, this hasn't really done anything because we've just assigned this element to this variable and we haven't done anything with it. One way in which we can edit this paragraph is by changing its text content, which is what's inside here, or what shows up in this preview here. So we can do test paragraph dot text content, and then if we want to change this paragraph's text to hello there, and we can set a test paragraph, or whatever the variable you define what it's named, and then dot text content equals, so we're treating this test paragraph dot text content as a variable here, and then we're setting it equal to hello there in quotes. So now if we run the code, you can see this text dynamically updates. However, if we try to insert some HTML code in here, in these quotes, in case we want to add HTML to make some text bold with the strong element, then as you can see, when we run this code, it literally puts in this text instead of putting in the strong element. However, there's another property that we can edit that'll help us do this. And this property is called inner HTML, with all the letters in HTML capitalized and inner lowercase. So now if we run this code, you can see this text is now, this hello there is now enclosed in the strong element and is therefore bold. Another way of selecting an element is by its class name. So for example, if I wanted to select elements with the class name example, then instead of using getElement by ID, I can use getElements by class name. And then in the quotes, replace it with the name of the class, which is example. And then these are going to be multiple paragraphs because this getElements by class name returns an array-like object containing all of the elements with that specific class name. And so as a result, if we run the code, you can see this doesn't work. And that's because test paragraphs doesn't hold a single element anymore, but rather an array like object containing all the elements that were matched in the document. So, for example, in order to modify the first element, which contains the class example, we can use a pair of square brackets before the variable name and then do 0. And now you can see this text is modified. The reason why indexes are 0 start with 0 and not 1 is because array-like objects are 0 indexed, meaning the 0, if an item has an index of 0, it actually means it's the first element. However, if we want to access all of the elements at once that have the class name example, instead of selecting the first element and then the second element and then keep going until we've reached all the elements, we can use a loop to iterate through all of them. So the way you create a loop to go through all the elements is by using the for keyword here. And if you click on for of loop in the auto completion, then you can see this code automatically gets generated. If you're not using the sandbox and you're using Notepad or TextEdit, you'll have to type this in manually. But firstly, we can change this let to const because none of the references to the paragraphs will be changing. And then we can change this name to paragraph, and we can change the collection to test paragraphs. And so inside these parentheses, this is basically saying for each paragraph in the test paragraphs, because of this of keyword here. And then we can access all of the individual paragraph elements just by using paragraph. And this time we don't need to put an index because this is already just a normal paragraph because it's iterating through all the items in this collection. And then we can say .text content equals hello, I am modified, just like before. And you can see it works exactly the same way. Another way of accessing elements is by choosing them based on their tag name, such as P in this case. So in this variable initialization here up at the top, we can change get elements by class name to get elements by tag name. And then instead of example, we can change it to P to select all the paragraph elements in this document. And now if we run the code, you can see all of the paragraphs in this page are modified with this new text. Another way to access elements is by using a CSS selector. In the same way that you select elements of style with CSS. You can do this by making use of query selector, of the query selector method of the document element. And so this query selector selects the first element in the page that matches this CSS selector. So for example, if I were to do .eg1, then it would select the first element with the class name eg1, which in this case would be this element that says I have two classes. And then we can try changing its value. So we can say hello, for instance. And now you can see this first element with the class eg1 is edited. This also allows you to select elements with more than one class. So for example, if I did .eg1, .eg2, then it would select the first element in the page with the classes of both eg1 and eg2, which is this last one right here. If we wanted to select all the elements that match the specific criteria, then we can use query selector all instead of just query selector. I've made the selector back to .eg1 so that we can see that multiple elements are selected. And then we can change this back to text paragraphs because this is again a collection. And then we can create that for of loop again, change the let to const, and then paragraph of test paragraphs like how we did before. And then we can set each paragraph's text content to imeg1. And now as you can see, both of these elements with the class name of eg1 are edited. Another way that you can modify these elements is by changing their styles. So the way you do that is by, after the paragraph element that you want to change the style of, type .style, and then look at any of the CSS properties in this CSS reference page on MDN, which I'll link in the description. For example, in this case, I'll do color because it's easily visible because it'll change the color of the text. In fact, we can even do background color so that it's really visible. However, instead of typing background dash color, you have to type it in camel case. So background color like this, with the C capital and everything else lowercase. because JavaScript doesn't support dashes in variable or property names. And then we can set it equal to red, for example, and you can see all the elements now have a red background. This concludes episode 11 of the Building Interactive Website series. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to look out for episode 12.